if you look at Asia generally, there are many big cities like Bangkok. There's the Jakartas, Saigon, Shanghai, etc. These huge sprawling cities, and a lot of them have very similar problems of slums and so forth. But you'd have to say that Thailand has escaped the worst of the poverty. You don't get what you see in the Philippines or Jakarta, and you don't get complete sweeping away of the past like you get in China. You get lots of layers happening simultaneously together, and that's one of its charms, is that you can find within the city elements that have never been swept away fully, but it's never let to drop as low as you get in truly terrible slums elsewhere. And the Thais have had quite a contrary experience with their bureaucracy. On one level it's very sclerotic and corrupt and so forth, but on another level they are quite concerned with things like provision of the basic services, the electricity, the water, the health. And so there is a way in which this city, chaotic that it seems, actually functions in a lot of fundamentals. Basically, the city at that time had only just got its first expressway, and people didn't really use it because there was a charge and people weren't used to the idea, and they said, oh, nobody will ever use the expressways if you have to pay for them. Just like when the SkyTrain started after several years, oh, nobody will ever use that because they've got to pay too much. And of course now they're packed, and the city's starting to develop along the lines of the public transport. But at that time it was very difficult to get across the city at all. People who had commutes that would now take 15 minutes were taking 2 hours. And so people didn't really venture into other areas, and they stayed either around their home or their work, which were often in certain set zones, and it was quite an adventure to go across town and find a particular restaurant or go to a particular market, or find an unusual bar that was in a different part of town. But when you've got a listings guide, you can start to patch things together and decide, oh, after Chatuchak Market we'll go to that funky bar up in Wipawati Road, and then we'll go to this folk club after that, and then come back late night, rather than thinking in terms of just one thing at a time. And so it was an opening up of the city. And so I've come from the city being very impenetrable, including for Thais, who are just as much restricted to their own zones, to becoming one that people can get around relatively easily. And the area in which I've been working, things like popular culture, if you look at street food, it was there, but it wasn't celebrated. There was very few people, a few pioneers that were talking about it. But we carried street food listings from the first issue. And after maybe 10 years or so, you started to get street food guides appearing. And they were usually people who knew those pioneering foodies. And after it became a little bit more mainstream, things like the tourist authorities and guidebooks and so on started including street food as an attraction. And now it's integral, and Thai street food has got to the level that there's international TV series being produced about Thai street food. So it's become a phenomenon that's identified with the country, when it was something people ignored and just took for granted 20 years before. I think the motorcycle taxi has become a little bit of a contemporary emblem for Bangkok. When I got here, I was aware of them existing in Southeast Asia. I'd seen them in Jakarta, but in Bangkok they seem to be more organized and a bit more creative. They used to have these very different jackets. Each one in each street was different, and many of them were very creative and handmade and very bright colors. And they were often sponsored by companies or businesses in the street, because they were just a service. But nobody really cared about them as a cultural symbol. And they've slowly gone from being overlooked service to becoming an icon, and it's gone through different processes. one of the things that happened when Thaksin first became Prime Minister about 10 years ago was that there were certain services that were extended to them, like licensing, I think some welfare issues and things like this, so that moving it away from the gangsterism towards a legitimate role, some status, and they standardized the jacket to make it more of a uniform. And Thais love uniforms, so once you've got your official uniform, there's a raise in status. And then they, during the protest periods in the mid-2000s, they became a bit like a cavalry / intelligence unit / mobile service for the protests. So they became quite identified as a symbol of those protests. And then the establishment started to court them, and they would put them on election posters, and they would put them on these little patriotic video clips that you get in advertisements, where they're talking about inclusiveness of Thais, and suddenly you'd find motorcycle taxi drivers included as one of the types of a Thai people, whereas previously it might have been a farmer, a hill tribe person, something like this being included with modern Thais. Now you were getting these semi-skilled, lower middle class, upper working class people being included as part of the national picture. And as a result, we've ended up with, there's a certain, not quite kudos about them, but they've got they're part of the charm of the city. One thing that Thais like is convenience. Thais themselves will say that they're a bit lazy, and it's understandable in this climate. It's very humid and hot, and people don't want to move around fast. So one of the conveniences is that the services come to the customer. So the food comes to the customer, the vendors come to the customer selling products, whether it's roving, going around the street like a hawker, or whether it's setting up a stand in the street that is providing a service just straight outside your office or outside your home. And very often at what they call backside, the mouth of the side street, the mouth of the lane, where you get a lot of services congregating at the junction between these little lanes and the big highways, near the bus stop, near the place where you can catch the taxis or get the SkyTrain. There's this little sort of ecology going on at the mouth of the Soi, filled with all kinds of services that people will find handy. And when I go back to the West, I find you have to get in a car to go to a out-of-town complex to find maybe half of the services that you'd get on the corner of your street in Bangkok. It's part of the way that Thais interact. They're quite they've got a politeness culture, which is in many ways non-touch. That even the greeting, the Y, there's not, not physically touching. But among peer groups, Thais are very easy and do use touch a lot. And you'll often see motorcycle taxi drivers or vendors or everyday people in the street giving each other massages. And if you go to the protest sites that have spring up from time to time in Bangkok, you'll always find massage corners in them. If you go to the airport, you'll find massage. It's part of the sense that it's a holistic sense. Life includes healing, and so there's herbal remedies. There are medicinal qualities to the food. If you talk to Thais about their food, one of the earliest things they'll say, that anyone will say, is, "Oh, food's medicine." It's not just fuel for our bodies, it's also curatives. And there are lots of herbs and ingredients in Thai food that have known properties that make people either resistant to illness or can cure conditions. And this has enabled Thailand to pivot that whole healing side into an industry. It's been one of the leaders of spa technologies, spa products, and also the spa services, the way that people are pampered and made to feel special for a few hours. This was one of the most important stories of recent times, and we're still feeling the effects of it in many ways. Up until that period, for about a decade, Thailand had been booming, and it had been unrestrained, unregulated, and there was an obsession for imports, and a lot of the traditional culture was being junked. Old markets, wooden products, and so forth, and people wanted the shiny new import. And then the crash happened, the baht collapsed, and suddenly the country was not able to afford these imports like before, so they had to look at their own resources. And at the same time, lots of architects who were building condominiums and offices before were unemployed. But these were people who were used to looking at materials, at design, at concepts that were creative. And a lot of them became designers, and they were or founding small businesses based on indigenous things. So they were using local fibers to make furniture. They were using things like herbs to make products that were modern products with the old materials, as opposed to purely an old style medicine. And this really helped the Thai design industry get off the ground. It helped the spa industry. It helped all kinds of businesses start up and get fresh ideas from within the culture. And there was a big revival afterwards of local things, which they call pumpanya, which is like local wisdom. And that was one of the reasons why the popular culture and folk culture has had this second wind, that it's become the fuel for a new economy and things like the spa industry. Thais have a kind of instinctive aesthetic sense. It's quite interesting that they are able to impart some kind of style that's happened throughout history in Thailand, which is a general elongation of forms. The Thais don't tend to invent very much. They're not an original creator culture, but what they do is they riff and they reinvent and they localize imported culture. In a sense, they're like Japan in that way. Japan is quite a non-inventing culture, strangely enough. They tend to take models from elsewhere and then they do wonderful things to it that are Japanese, and they immediately look Japanese because they have a set of values. And the Thais do too. They infuse a lot of their beliefs in auspicious qualities into their products and their services, and they have this genteel line that comes from nature, but they've made it almost unnaturally beautiful. And actually, the forms they use are from nature. They're originally Indian forms mostly, and they came. You can follow a cultural path around Europe. The Thais use a lot of forms that are from nature, and many of them came from India, and they made their way to Siam through other parts of Asia, like Java and Cambodia. But in this land, they became elongated and made more graceful. And one of the things that Thais do, which you can see in their flower design, is they'll deconstruct the actual plant itself, the petals, the stamens, the shapes. Then they will reattach these elements into another form. So they'll use one type of plant to make another plant. And they will put these into garlands, into offerings on an altar, or into some kind of arrangement that's got an auspicious quality. So often, for example, they'll use amaranth flowers to create a lotus flower. The lotus has got a lot of symbolism from Buddhism and so forth, and they'll put these on an altar, but the amaranth flower won't ever wilt. It'll stay like that. And in the garlands they'll use petals from roses. So they don't have the rose, they have the petals from the rose to make another element that looks like something in their auspicious culture. And it'll also have the level of scent. Thais are very keen on bringing in multiple senses into their culture and ritual. We're not so used to using scent in the West, and just we use perfumes. But here it's part of this idea of medicinal food. The food is very pungent in its scent. You'll find a lot of products have got a strong sense of scent. And generally when visitors come to Thailand, they talk about this sort of overpowering assault on the senses. And it is something that people definitely feel here. Everything's very intense. The flavors are all intense, and sometimes it's pungent, sometimes it's perfumed, but it's always very strong and intense. If you look at something like Thai fortune telling, in the West there's a kind of pseudoscientific astrology as the main thrust of fortune telling. Here, fortune telling mixes elements from the Chinese zodiac, from the Western zodiac, from Western tarot, from numerology, from Indian beliefs to do with gods of various different elements, and they combine all these different things also with elements like the Chinese face reading, or reading the moles on the body. And they will also have folk beliefs in there to do with divining forms and numbers from natural objects. Like they'll maybe put baby powder on a tree, rub it, and find something in there as giving them lottery number clues. There was one story about this lizard, poor lizard, that was apparently if you rubbed the lizard, numbers appeared, and it got rubbed by so many people it was really suffering. So there's a very strong difference between the pious side and then the very almost base side of looking at beliefs to get lottery numbers to make yourself richer. And there are some tensions where, for example, monks might be dispensing numbers that can be interpreted as being lucky for the lottery. And so on one level the authorities get very upset about monks doing this rather than being unworldly. But you've got this popular taste that accesses religion from a very practical point of view, and making merit is on one level a very sacred act, that you're improving your karma by good works. On another level, you're maybe donating to a temple or doing good works in order to get material benefit for yourself in life, either indirectly through karma or directly by looking good within society and being perceived as being a good person who donates to good causes. So there's this interplay between practical religion and very spiritual religion. And on top of that, there are other beliefs to do with Brahmanic Hinduism, from the Brahmins that came centuries ago to Thailand. And at the top end of the religious spectrum, you've got these Brahmin priests that conduct royal rituals, that conduct civic rituals. Also, they can be hired to run a blessing ceremony at the beginning of a business, or for example at the beginning of a TV series. If this was a TV series made in Thailand, you would have an altar of Brahmin offerings and presided over by a Brahmin priest, and all the crew and actors and so forth would be attending it, and they'd be setting off that production on a lucky footing. And then you go through lots of other trends and fashions. So from the big infusion of Thai Chinese input into the culture. You've got a strong belief in Guanyin, or Guanyin, which has got different pronunciations. And she is the goddess of compassion. She was also the goddess of seafarers, and most of the Chinese came here by the sea. And so you'll find her now in Thai Buddhist temples, worshipped just as along with Hindu gods, along with the Buddha and so forth. You can buy all kinds of accoutrements, accessories, things like your house or your car or your mobile phone or your bottle of whiskey that you keep behind the bar, a posh brand that you wear with your handbag as opposed to one you might buy off the street. They are status objects, and so money becomes a measure of that. There's perhaps some Americanized influence during the Vietnam War period, when Thailand did emerge as a westernized country. There's also very strong Chinese influence in the commercial world in Thailand, and the Chinese are very much a money culture. And so these elements together have made Thailand quite a commercial location. You've got the lucky side to money from the Chinese, and you've got the highly commercial, corporatized approach to money. It's not just in the local culture. I would say that in many ways the Thai approach to globalized business is very loose and open, and so there's that money side too. There's also an element that people see of corruption and bribery, and the idea that you can get things done through money. That's true. It's true across Asia, and it exists in the West as well. I would say here there's less of a cultural barrier to it being taking place, and part of that is due to a tradition of making offerings. To some degree, there's not much different between putting the favorite drink of a spirit, maybe the spirit likes red drinks, you put a red drink on the altar with the hope that this deity will help protect you. How different is that from giving some money to an official in order that they protect your interests? Or that a vendor gives some protection money to somebody who's running that area of the street market in order of protection, so you've guaranteed your spot. There's an element that it's so infused into the culture that you make an offering to higher, darker powers in order to preserve your interests or further your wealth and so forth. And while there's a lot of moralistic prudery, historically, just like with former British colonies that have very restrictive sexual rules, actually those were adopted from that colonial era. And just like you'll find in former colonies where there's very strict rules, Thailand has some of those rules, but maybe more in attitudes than actual laws. So you've got a fairly open view of sexuality here. It's very practical. There's not so much of a sense of sin, and you would find also some hangovers from the social situation of polygamy. It was very common here historically, and then it was banned. But it still continues in the context of minor wives. So someone who's wealthy or who's got the ability to support more than one wife would have minor wives, but there would be a difference in status between those women. The first wife would be the head of the family, the matriarch, the legitimate one, and there's more fun to be had with the minor wife. They separate those functions out a bit. It just happens that in the West we combine them in the modern context of marriage, how it has been maybe for a century and a half, because it keeps changing. But we tend to combine all those things within a binary relationship, and in other parts of the world they may separate out these functions into different social scenes. Recent decade we've seen a lot of protests from two different sides, at least two different sides, but actually it's part of a process that's been going on for nearly a century between modernizing forces and conservative forces, also forces that are aligned with different personalities. There are very strong personalities that have evolved in Thai politics over the past century, and some of those people come to be dictators. Some of them become figures that are viewed as filled with moral good, and there are various figures that are in that political game. And if you look at the more recent thinking about the power structures in Thailand, it's often referred to as a network. And there's a difference in balance between them, the shifting alliances. And so it's a movable picture. And broadly, there is this conservative or progressive side. Sometimes the progressive side becomes regressive because it might be military. And other times, what might be perceived as conservative is more liberal than the modernizing change. So it's never really one stable picture, and there's never really one group dominating completely, which is why you're able to have the center of the city occupied by one group and then by another group. And there's this interchange between governments, whether some are changed by military coups, some are changed by what they call judicial coups, others by the normal way that politics changes governments. But there's never one force that's strong enough to overpower the other, and that's definitely been true of the past decade, where no side is able to lead a knockout blow against the other side. They're almost equally matched in numbers. If you talk to a lot of people, whether they're Thais or observers of long standing, they'd say that for a very long time you could predict the drift of what's going to happen and see how it would play out, and there was a certain set of unwritten rules which people didn't overstep or accepted as being the way it is, and things slotted into place, which is possibly why a lot of the coups have not extended on for a long time. They were settled pretty quickly. If you look back in Thai history, even back a very long time, back to centuries past, when dynasties changed and there were overthrows and conquests and whatever, you'd find the new setup was settled pretty quickly, and people would fall in line but under whatever was the new settlement. What's different this time is that Thaksin Shinawatra, who rose to power as a telecoms tycoon from being a policeman to then, after the coup, becoming identified as an unlikely champion of democracy among the emergent middle-class peasantry, he didn't give up. He didn't accept this old settlement that there was a certain way of doing things. And in one sense, you've got the different sides are suddenly playing by different rules. In the past, it would have settled down with one side or other prevailing for a while, but it hasn't settled this time because to some degree they're talking past each other. They're talking on different story levels, And Thaksin's been very dogged, and he's had the means to be able to insist that he can't be ignored. And that has empowered people who have lined behind him, because they sense that he's a strong horse to back, that their interests could be furthered by what he's doing. And it's, on the other side, people who don't like him have been rather scared and frightened by his lack of willingness to concede. They maybe have built him into a bigger ogre than perhaps he is in real life. That he's this unrelenting person that there hasn't been much precedent for in Thai history. People have always relented and given way a bit in the past. So there's a sense of he's unsettled some fundamental ways that business was done in politics over centuries in this country. And so he's a new phenomenon. And even up through the recent coups, there was always, and the changes in between who was in power and who wasn't, even during his period, it had been a little bit predictable. But right now, people don't really know what's going to happen. They really don't know. It's still up in the air. And so we don't know how that's going to affect the destiny of the country and the destiny of Bangkok. One thing that is different this time is the level of interpersonal animosity between supporters. In the past, politics was a game largely played between power brokers at the top, and they would mobilize supporters, but in the end it was mainly at the top that the changes were. But politics has become more of a mass phenomenon involving the new lower middle class, and now involving the middle class. And they are jostling for what they feel is survival. They're probably seeing it in more apocalyptic terms than an outsider sees it in. We can see it's a society evolving, but it seems to be in the mindset of a lot of local people that it's a last chance saloon. That if we don't do this now, we'll never have the opportunity again. It's like it's now or never. And it's probably an exaggeration because these things ebb and flow. But we're in a heightened moment, and it's spilling over into interpersonal relationships, in families, in business, among friends, people defriending one another on Facebook. There's an awful lot of hate speech. If you go through the protest areas, you'll see what's written over pictures of the Thaksin, what they call the Thaksin regime. And similarly, when they had the occupation of the centre of Bangkok by the red shirts in 2010, a lot of the graffiti written about the other side was using a very strong language too. So there's a sense of we don't know interpersonally how that will play out in just the personalities of people. Will the personality of the Thai change? We're at quite a fundamental sea change here. We don't know whether it's just a phase or whether people ever get over what they've heard being called about them from the other side.